I think when it comes to thinking about reparations in the United States, we can't move forward and properly heal as a nation without addressing the past. And we know that the racial wealth gap continues to proliferate, partly because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. Black people have 10 times less wealth than the average white person. And education has not been the great equalizer that people thought it once was. College educated blacks have 7 times less wealth compared to college educated whites. And research documents that we can trace the racial wealth gap back to slavery and Jim Crow segregation. Look, reparations has been given essentially to all other groups except for Black people. So it's not that the United States is opposed to reparations. Instead, the opposition seems to be specifically targeted toward Black Americans. And that's something that needs to change if we're going to move forward and finally get past racism. So Delegate Juanita Fisher has been leading the charge on the Harriet Tubman Community Investment Act for the state of Maryland to think about ways to address the legacy of slavery throughout the state, and has put together a proposal, a package of sorts, really a New Deal package that addresses home ownership, business ownership, and education, knowing that these are three of the main pillars that oftentimes lead to the racial wealth gap and lead to gateways for people being able to build wealth. I think that one of the only ways to move forward, based on all the research that I conducted looking at various ways to address racism in America, is to actually atone for it. There was a wrong that was committed, and the state of Maryland in particular played a strong role in that, specifically in terms of selling a large number of Black people who were enslaved farther down south, splitting up families. So there's definitely something to be done here, and Delegate Juanita Fisher and others have been leading the charge. I think so. So part of what happens, and Senator Cory Booker says this a lot, that change doesn't come from Washington, change comes to Washington. And we know that over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of momentum at the congressional level, at the federal level. We know about H.R. 40, the classic legislation to address slavery in America. But then also, we know about a recent Truth and Reconciliation legislation. So part of thinking about atoning for slavery isn't simply economic. It's also about it's also about restoring communities. And part of that restoration deals with education, it deals with healing, it deals with understanding. So yes, obviously there's a large economic component, but there's another part of that. And when we think about the kind of suburban cities, these auxiliary areas to larger cities, they speak to something important, that Black people were oftentimes pushed out and pushed down. They oftentimes didn't have access to certain communities. So part of thinking about a greenbelt or even an Evanston or Asheville is that these are communities that have oftentimes had growing Black populations that have been highly segregated and have also impacted housing segregation. And see, that's the key point of what's happening in Greenville. Yes, there is a slavery component there, but this is also primarily about the exclusion of people from housing, very similar to what happened in Evanston, where Black people were excluded from being able to purchase homes. And then they were segregated in the homes that they could purchase. The value wasn't up to par, and they were also redlined additionally, where oftentimes they were charged higher interest rates, higher fees, and higher services for similar property that their white counterparts received. Well, I mean, it's clear that the city council moved forward with this. And part of thinking about that is it's going to be interesting to see what voters do. Greenbelt is a very interesting community, a very inclusive community that aims to be equitable, aims to be transparent. So I think it will be a barometer for a lot of other cities, not just in the state of Maryland, but throughout the country, to have people vote on reparations. I think it will actually be a huge barometer for people thinking about putting legislation on the ballot. Because when we look at public attitudes, we see across the board that people are opposed to it. However, there are groups of individuals who are more likely to be supportive. Obviously, people who are younger, people who are more liberal and progressive, and people who also fundamentally understand history and the way that race and racism has played a role in founding our nation. Look, we have to remember that when we go back to the 1850s, Black people's physical bodies were worth more than railroads and factories put together. We haven't even got to the products that they produce yet or their labor. We fast forward another 60 years, we are deeply embedded in Jim Crow segregation. Black people were restricted from access to building wealth. And we know that in America today, about 50% of people's wealth is oftentimes wrapped up or starts with real estate. And they use that real estate to build additional wealth, to invest in the stock market, to send their children to college, to start up businesses. So when we start talking about a green belt and people voting on that, when people have that knowledge, that's something that's a big deal. And look, this is simply to establish a commission. I mean, we have to think about the bar we're talking about. We're not talking about whether or not they're voting on whether or not reparations should be given yet. Simply voting on a commission. And throughout the country, similar to the federal government, people in Congress have not even been willing to vote on establishing a commission. Like we already know what the problems are. Now, part of thinking about the solution is something that requires a commission to think through who will qualify, what a reparations package would look like. There are a lot of different ways. People generally think about only individual cash payments, but it could be down payment assistance or housing revitalization grants, like what's going on in Evanston. So there are a lot of different models that could come into play that a commission could actually help sort through.